Hello, and welcome to your Daily Strength Coach Podcast, Episode 3, High versus Low. Hello, and welcome to Episode 3 of your Daily Strength Coach Podcast. Today's date is 25th of the 6th, 2015. Today we're going to be answering questions from the YouTube asked by Jean Francis. Sorry if I butchered the pronunciation of your name there, John. John's asked a few questions before in some of the other formats we've had, question and answer series, and some of the other podcasts. Always been very insightful and quite enjoyable questions to answer, but not easy questions to answer. You have to do a little bit of thinking. So he's asked two questions, and that's just down on the comment section of the podcast too. Question 1, could you do an analysis of how Shilko's training plans are working, or high frequency, moderate intensity programs in general? This is actually my second take of this podcast episode, because he tripped me up on the second question, so I had to actually go and do a little bit of research. What I was saying on the first one is, to answer that question properly and give it the attention that it deserves, it's probably better answered in another format, probably in the program breakdown format. That is a question I've had asked before as a program to break down. It is one I will do, and possibly one I will do soon, very soon, possibly, possibly at the weekend, depending on how the weekend goes. But well, I've said before, like Shilko's work, I was aware of Shilko probably from T Nation, where I became aware of Shilko probably going on 10 years ago now. And obviously is an immense track record with lifters from the IPF. But I hadn't really paid a lot of attention to his work until he brought out his website and he started doing the question and answers on YouTube. And after watching a couple of the question and answers and kind of getting more into them, all I knew was a high quality coach, but for some reason never really thought to try out any of his programs or pay attention to his work. I've went on his forums a few times. I've read through a lot of his articles, and his stuff is, to be quite frank, it's quite excellent. So it's something I will definitely look at, because I think it will prove educational for me. I've already had a look at some of his programs, but nothing really massively in depth. So I'll try to break it down on a program breakdown episode. Would probably be useful, because I think the visual aids of the graphs and things probably lend itself better to understanding how a programming works. It's difficult to talk through how like kind of the volume and intensity are offset against each other. It's much easier to see in a graph. And the second question, which I'll answer just now, following your article on applying Charlie Francis' system to powerlifting, how much training volume should one lifter spend in each of the categories you defined? Also, how should the repartition of volume change with the experience of the lifter? Now, this is where you tripped me up, because I went to actually I had a little bit of parabola, or a little bit of preamble about who Charlie Francis was and what the system meant, and then I went and I couldn't remember what the classifications of the volume were, so I had to go back and get the article. So I'll answer that quickly, but just to kind of reiterate what I had said in the first take, Charlie Francis was a sprinting coach. He was Ben Johnson's sprinting coach. He coached during the early 80s through the late 80s, and then Ben Johnson won Olympic gold at the Seoul Olympics and got popped for Stanzadrol. So then Charlie Francis was serving a lifetime ban as a coach, so that kind of dirtied his name. But Charlie Francis is probably one of the, if you're into like practical solutions to things, Charlie Francis is probably one of the best coaches you can read. Is all very applicable, and it's all based in producing actual, world class performers. I personally take a lot of issue with some of the information sources that people use for various things, nutrition, speed training, sports conditioning, when people aren't actually producing champions. It's not really enough to work with people. Like, if you know the right people, or you stick around the right environment, you can get on to work with elite performers, but it doesn't mean that you're going to make those elite performers champions, or you're going to improve their actual outcomes. It just means you're working with them, so it doesn't really mean much. But yeah, so kind of his training philosophy, or partitioned his week, was he would have a high day where they do any of this. It was a high CNS loading day. So that would be anything with a maximal acceleration, so sprinting over 95% of max velocity, or in lifting sense, it would be any heavy lifting that he would do, or any kind of heavy loading plyometrics like drop jumps or anything like that, any sort of thing like that. And then on his low day, that's when he would do his kind of lower level stuff, so his non-CNS intensive work, so conditioning, things like his tempo runs, his med ball circuits that would use like his active recovery. It could be like 400 to 500 throws of various forms, but it was more of like a rhythm workout. Also, he'd probably do like rhythm work, so like A walks, things like that. In those low days, things aren't going to require a lot of muscular force output or a lot of recruitment of high threshold motor patterns. So what I did in that article, which I released on March 18th of this year, was I tried to extrapolate that out onto a lifter, and more specifically like a powerlifting schedule. So if we look at how Charlie Francis put out classified intensity, he classified intensity of high intensity 95 to 100% of all-time best, medium intensity to 76 to 94% all-time best, and low intensity to 75% and a below of best sprint time ever or slower. So he didn't really do any kind of medium intensity work because his bullet point was it's too slow to be specific to training an objective, too high to recover adequately in 24 hours, and CNS recovery limited by lack of circulatory response. So I kind of took those classifications and ran with them a little bit. So my classifications were: high for lifting was anything above 85% RM, pros, highly specific training, teaches lifter how to brace and execute maximal lifts. Cons of this training, this training intensity: taxing on recovery. Lifter can only spend so much time in this zone, not go backwards. And then my medium zone was 75 to 85%. And pros for this were specific strength gains can be realized, great for building size and strength. The cons: taxing on recovery. Skill acquisition is not specific to maximal execution. If you lift in that 75 to 85% zone, you will get stronger, but you won't be able to display that strength without going into that high percentage. Because that high percentage is a very specific skill, lifting over 90% plus. And my low classification was under 75%. Lifter can learn general skill attributes of the lift, not taxing on recovery, and strength building capacity is limited, although it is there if the volume is high enough. And then the non-specific training volume was under 6%. Great for hypertrophy work with low rest. Can give movement around joints to promote recovery. Cons for powerlifting specifically are strength training. Non-specific training, if not targeted, can be a waste of time. So that kind of went into what was my week structure, where I had day one was a high day, where we were working 80-85% of all our lifts that we're interested in getting stronger on. Day two was a low day, where we were working at 70 with a single session at 70% of our lifts, and we do some light conditioning. And day three was active rest, so it was bodybuilding work done at that non-specific volume, so under 6%. So 5 sets, 10, 50%, and like a stretching session. And then that was repeated again. So you had a high, a low, an active rest, and then you had a total rest day where you do swim, yoga, or Pilates, or light activity. I'll link the article in the description so you can have a look at it and see what I was kind of cracking on to. But yeah, just to actually get on to answering that question, it's probably a bit too much preamble. We're going to go over the 10-minute mark on this one. How much training lifters should one volume spend in each of their categories you defined? If you're talking about just in general, then I would say it depends on the phase of your training. You can block it up, which I think works quite well for lifters. I know it gets bagged on quite a lot, but having a period of like 2 to 3 weeks where you're spending some time in a low setting with a high number of reps. So let's say I'm just going to throw out numbers here. Let's say you're doing 80 reps per lift in a week for 2 weeks at 60 to 70%, and then you come into 70 to 80%. So you drop the volume on that. You go to 60 reps per lift per week. In that 70-80% range, spend, let's say, 2 to 3 weeks doing that, and then you come into the 80 to 90% range. You drop down to 30 reps per lift per week, and let's say you're in that zone for maybe 1 to 2 weeks. So I wouldn't spend a lot of time in that zone, and I certainly wouldn't go into the 90 to 100% zone unless you're coming towards a meet. If you're just training kind of in an off-season scenario, or you're just training to get stronger, there's no meets coming up, I would probably just flip-flop between the 60 to 70% zone with a high volume and come into the 70 to 80% zone with a moderate volume, and just come flip-flop in and out of that. There's no real reason to go into the 80 to 90% zone. You maybe dip into the last week or 2 weeks of your training cycles, but most people can adequately get stronger, kind of lifting 60 to 80% and just letting the volume do the work. There's no huge amount of need to go to 80-90%. There's certainly no need to go 90 to 100% unless you're peaking for a meet or you actually want to see what you're capable of. I'm sure quite a lot of lifters who have worked under me will attest to this. Anytime they test their strength, they're stronger. There's no real need to lift at those intensities unless you want to see where you're at or you want to peak for a meet. And then also, how should the repartition of volume change with the experience of the lifter? To be honest, it doesn't really change too much. The more experienced the lifter becomes, the more accurately you're going to be able to know where that volume lies, where that volume sweet spot lies. For me personally, I think my best volume loads probably, it depends on the lift. Let's do a little quick calculation here. For bench press, my sweet spot seems to be 70 to 80 reps per week. For squat, it seems to be between 40 to 50 reps a week, and for deadlift, it seems to be I don't know where it is for deadlift, but certainly anything over 30 to 40 reps a week for deadlift for me is too much. So I need to find a way of training deadlift for that lower volume. Like Shuko talks about, like some lifters who will complete like thousands of lifts in a month, and other lifters who will do hundreds of lifts in a month. It just depends on the individual lifter. As a novice, I would just assume that you would do something like a starting strength is a good example of a good program to begin on, because it has the key lifts in it and it just has a blanket volume, and from there you can just pay attention to the training process as opposed to actually individualizing or optimizing your programming. It's more about taking part in the process and learning as it is to actually individualize your training volume. But yeah, I don't think there is no definitive answer of what is the optimal volume per lifter. It depends on the individual, and after working with someone for a while, I'll probably have a good idea of where that optimal would lie. And you'll see from me, it varies lift to lift, not just person to person, but also lift to lift. So yeah, that concludes this daily strength coach podcast. And so ran over a little bit. Apologies about that. Okay. Questions and answers, please send them to speedpowerperformance@gmail.com, or leave a comment section under any of the episodes. I'll pick them up. Probably best under this episode though. Yeah. Until tomorrow. This is Mark, castironstrength.com, signing off, or should I say, onlinestrengthcoach.com. This is Mark signing off. But your past was so